Good morning. Still morning, right? Barely. Last year at the SSC meeting, Dean Radin did a presentation about some data he had collected with Bill and a couple other guys in the Faraday cage at IONS. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So after their talk was over, I went up and I talked to Dean and I talked to Bill and I said, you know, I do signal processing in real life. I'd like to get this data and look at it. Is that okay? And those of you who know Bill will understand when I tell you his answer was, of course, I would love to exploit you. And so he, gave me the data, or Dean gave me the data. And so we're going to talk about some of that today. When Dean looked at the data before, he did find some interesting differences between control signals and healing scenarios, but nothing that seemed to be very systematic. Although they did, as Bill mentioned, discover that if they play these signals as audio for sensitives, intuitive people, they could blindly tell the difference between the two. So that was interesting as well. The saga continues. What we're going to do now, I'm going to show you some work that I've been doing with the same original data that was collected before with very high spectral resolution and also some careful searches for short-term interesting things in the temporal data and some results that hopefully will be interesting. Quickly through the background, Bill kind of covered this already. The original data, there were 38 transducers, 33 magnetometers, X, Y, and Z axes, so that's 33, some EM sensors, and I don't know where the 51 always comes from. When Dean gave me the data, he said, I have 20 recordings. He gave me 20, ultimately, to work with. Okay, that's fair. The sampling was 44.1 kilohertz, which is the standard sampling rate for CD audio, which made it very easy for them to play these signals that were not originally audio as audio signals, 24-bit resolution. This picture Bill already had up, so I won't spend any time on that. It shows the inside of the Faraday cage with all the little sensors sprinkled around. And of the 20 sessions that I worked with that were recorded, there are some that are control sessions where there is nothing in the box. There are some where there are a healer and a patient both in at the same time and doing healing work. There are some where there are healers charging cotton or other artifacts. And there are some where there's a patient and artifacts but no healer present. So we have all those scenarios to look at. The two analysis methods are pretty straightforward that I'm going to talk to you about. Spectral analysis. Most of these FFTs, in fact, I think all of them I'm going to show you cover 300-second records. The fundamental frequency resolution you can get is the reciprocal of that, so it's well below 100th of a hertz, which allows you, among other things, to look very closely at very low frequencies, which will turn out to be important. And then a couple of approaches to the temporal analysis. First, I looked at histograms of signal amplitude, where you basically just say, okay, how many signals are this big, how many are this big, how many are this big of the samples. Sort those into bins to get a probability distribution. And then also searching for anything short-term anomalies, anything that looks strange or different about the time domain signal. In the beginning, I looked at two recordings. Dean said, I'm just going to give you two of these. One is a healing case, one is a control case. I'm not going to tell you which one is which. Go look at the data and tell us what you see. So I did that, and we did see some interesting differences between the two. When I looked at it, I had file 17 and file 18. I don't know which is which. Turned out afterwards, 18 was the healing case where Bill and two other guys were charging cotton, and then the control case was nothing in the Faraday cage except a crystal, I think, sitting on the table. And then later they gave me the rest of the recordings, or at least I hadn't ended up with 20. Maybe Dean's still holding on to 31. I don't know about that. But and then there's a whole variety of healing control scenarios to talk about. So there are a number of ways I could go through this. I thought the journey itself was interesting. So I'm going to take you through this kind of chronologically in the order that things develop. We're going to first talk about the histogram case, and then look a little bit at spectral analysis of the signal amplitudes, spectral analysis of the signals, and then temporal analysis of the signals, and then try to summarize some results. So I'm going to come back to this slide a few times, but we're going to first talk about the histograms. So If you look at these two bar charts, the one closest to me here, you'll see two bar charts side by side. There's a red or blue or purple. My daughters tell me I can't tell the difference between blue and purple very well, so it's the one that's not yellow is the control case, and the yellow is healing data. So over here, I got some histograms that look like this, which is what you'd expect if there's really nothing going on, almost the same thing, whether it's a healing scenario or a control scenario. But I also got some, like you see on the other side, which at first I thought was very interesting. Here it looks as though there's something very different about the healing case as opposed to the control case. However, it turned out that what was going on was there was some 60 hertz hum in that data set that was creating these larger excursions in the yellow data set. So that turned out to be kind of a dead end, and we gave up on that. So histograms didn't lead anywhere. Spectral analysis was a little more interesting. We're going to talk about two things that we found. One is sort of a general elevation of frequencies in the spectral frequency range below 5 hertz, it will turn out, between control cases and healing cases. And the other is a very narrow band, only about 1 hertz wide elevation, the difference between we see sometimes between healing cases and the control cases. First, I'm going to show you the whole spectrum. This is, since we had a 44 or so kilohertz sampling rate, this, I don't know whether you can read the scale, but it goes out to 22 kilohertz. This picture looks pretty much all red. It's just because I told the computer plot the blue curve, then plot the red curve, and the blue and the red curves fall almost exactly on top of each other, so you just see red. But if you expand the scale and you look at all those little peaks across there, you see almost no difference. So that looks like there's no difference between the healing case and the control case. This is the file 17 and 18 I started with, except if you look at the very, very low frequencies. This goes from 0 to 5 hertz, so this is the very low frequency range. And you'll see now we've got a significant difference showing up between the red, which is the healing case, and the blue, which is the control case. It's a pretty big difference. The vertical scale, I don't know if you can see it or not, is about 20 dB. So that's, in that frequency range, that's a factor of 10 in amplitude or 100 in power. So there's a lot of difference there. Turned out this was pretty consistent. For all 11 magnetometers in the Y channel, we saw differences like this. It doesn't happen in all the cases. It doesn't happen in either axes. Here is the x-axis of the same magnetometer. And you can see red and blue pretty much right on top of each other. So we had cases like this, and we had cases where there's a big difference. We never had a case the other way around where the blue is above the red. This is a different magnetometer, another significant difference between the two channels. This is magnetometer 7, here's magnetometer 3. So a lot of those. Now this is a slightly different scenario. The others I showed you were healer charging cotton was the healing case. In this case, there is no healer. This was charged cotton with a patient in the Faraday cage for the red curve. So here we have charged cotton showing an elevation with a patient versus the control case. And then there was one other scenario that came up where they took a 20-minute recording and they told the healers for 5 minutes just rest, and then for 5 minutes heal, for 5 minutes rest, for 5 minutes heal. I broke that up into 5-minute segments, of course, so we could compare the healing periods with the control periods. And in this case, it turns out that the elevated spectra always happen in the rest periods. Don't know what that means, but that's what we saw. Here's one example of a narrowband spectral elevation case, red versus the control case. Let's take a look at some of the temporal data. And there's two kinds of interesting events there. One I call ringing bursts. I'm going to show you some examples of this. They typically last a few seconds. They have ringing oscillations that pop up. They almost never happen unless there is a patient. There can be healers in patient, or there can be an artifact in a patient, but if the patient's not there, we don't see it. And then the other example is what I call impulse bursts. These are very short. They don't oscillate. They tended to pop up in lots of recordings and probably don't mean anything, so they're probably just spurious noise. So here is a ringing burst with some oscillations. here's another example of those, another couple of those. Here is an impulse burst, which you can see looks very different. And so let's try to summarize some of that. First of all the interesting events happened in the magnetometer channels, not in the others. We didn't see any of these interesting events when with an empty box, which is kind of reassuring, I think. Almost no events when there are only artifacts in the box. So there's really three scenarios of interest. There's a healer and a patient, or there is a healer working on an artifact, or there is an artifact and a patient. This is just a schematic. You can see the numbers sprinkled around. Those are just having to do with which sensor channel. So when we record an event, we can figure out where the event was recorded. So we're going to tabulate, are the events recorded near the healer, or near the patient, or in the table in between? And there's three kinds of events to talk about. The general spectral elevation, I showed you quite a few of those, or the narrowband elevation, we had one picture I showed you, but there are a lot of those, or these temporal ringing bursts. This tabulates the cases where we had a healer and a patient both present. Most of the time, this general spectral elevation seemed to happen on the healer side, 2 to 1 in this case. The narrowband spectral elevations all happened in this scenario on the patient side, and most of the temporal bursts happened on the patient side. I thought this was interesting. Maybe you would think that you'd be recording things around the healer who's doing something, but maybe if it's all happening from the patient, as Bill suggested, that explains why we're recording things, some of these events, over on the patient side instead. This is another scenario where we had a healer and an artifact, but no patient. Again, 2 to 1 or so, most of the general elevations happen on the healer side. The narrowband spectral elevations still happening on the patient side, even though there's not a patient there. Don't know what that means. And one temporal burst that happened on the healer side. I think this is the only event that we saw where there was a burst without a patient present. And then this is the last of the scenarios where we have patient and artifact. Only one of the low frequency spectral elevations seem to be on the patient side. The narrowband elevation, we had 4 of those, and they're on the healer side, even though there's no healer present. And 2 to 1 for temporal bursts on the patient side. So I don't think we have anything we can call conclusions, but there were maybe some interesting trends here. The temporal bursts with ringing seem to happen mostly near the patient, whether there's a healer present or an artifact present, they happen around the patient. They almost never happen when there isn't a patient. The narrowband spectral elevations also seem to happen mostly around the patient. And the general low frequency elevation pictures that I showed you quite a few of mostly seem to happen around the healer, either when they're charging cotton or charging some artifact, or when there's a healer and a patient present, but they're in a rest period. So that's the end. Looks like I'm just about on time. I want to thank Bill for letting me do the work, Dean for providing the data, and some helpful comments along the way. The Emerald Gate Charitable Trust, who I understand provided the original funding for the data collection, and to all of you for listening.
That's great work. Thank you very much. Questions?
The Faraday cage there is a very small enclosed space. Is there any kind of air conditioning or temperature control?
This was all before I was even in the project, but I bet Bill knows.
Okay. The reason I ask is that I've recorded similar signals to your ringing burst when a fan or a motor turns on. So I'm wondering if there's any kind of air conditioning that might be turning off and on near a patient who is actually heating
Bill, do you know?
the environment.
Bill says no. Bill says nothing like that in there.
Hello. I'm just wondering if you've done any sort of statistical analysis to try to evaluate the possibility, or preferably refute the possibility, that these various types of events, the ringing bursts, the impulse bursts, and so forth, are simply occurring at random, and they've happened to cluster around during the interesting periods.
I think that's an excellent question. I have a very short answer. No, Adam.
As you may know, at these low frequencies, typical Faraday shields has no effect. Are you planning to do anything with use magnetic material that can actually shield at this frequency range?
Well, I think two quick comments on that. One, I think the real answer to your question is I don't know. It depends on Bill and whether there's funding to do that. It would be a great thing to do. The other comment is that it's interesting to me that the effects seem to be, although we don't have any statistics, a little bit sorted the way they are between, things happen on this side versus that side. If it's a low frequency effect that's going through the Faraday cage, I don't know why it would favor healing versus control, et cetera. But it's a good question.
But in reality, the fact you get a Faraday cage there has no effect.
Yeah,
It doesn't affect that in that band.
yeah, okay.
That slide of the ringing burst really was impressive, and I apologize if I should have been following along a little better. What was, you know what I'm talking about?
The ringing burst, yes.
Yeah, what was the event that started it ringing?
Oh, well, we don't know what the event was when it started.
So it
ringing.
just...
We don't know. All we know is that it occurred during most of those occurred around the patient, and they occurred most of them during the rest period when there was a healer and a patient.
So
The healer and the patient are both in the space, and the healer is not actively healing.
Oh.
They're just kind of resting,
It just happened.
which might make some people wonder if maybe the healing happens when they let go rather than when they're actually trying to do something. I don't know.
But whatever that event was a very quick event.
Yeah. Only lasts a few seconds.
Now, a very interesting experiment. Thank you very much. Mike Turner, thank you.